I had thought previously that economists had invented the concept of spontaneous order, so it's somewhat humbling to discover that there are 16 other specializations among natural scientists and others that are already invented the concept before we did. Spontaneous order is an idea that I've been in love with for a long, long time in economic development. It's an idea celebrated by Hayek. It doesn't have really an ideological affiliation. It's also cited by people like Larry Summers and Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow. And yet, the development people often want to know, kind of what use is this idea to just say that development happens spontaneously? You know, we want to find something tangible with which we can reduce poverty. We want action plans. What use is all this talk about spontaneous order? And I think Kenneth Arrow actually gave what I think is the key insight that is actually helpful for us to appreciate in development. He said that, and he called this surely the most important intellectual contribution that all of economic thought has made to the study of society. And just the simple idea that effects may be very different from intentions through the workings of an entire system. It's that very simple idea that effects may be different from the intentions through the workings of an entire system, a system of spontaneous order that achieved all the things that Matt has shown. And appreciating why that happens and when it happens is one of the most important things that development economists can do. And that's what I want to give you some illustrations of today. I could give you lots of boring academic theory and empirical work that kind of demonstrate the whole idea of how development happens through spontaneous order. Or I could give you evocative examples that are fun to talk about. And of course, I chose the second option, as I always do. So let's give some examples of sort of unintended consequences. This is a sort of famous recent study in the foreign aid literature about food aid. That the intention of food aid is obviously to alleviate really bad famines in places where people are really in dire danger of starvation and early death from shortage of food. Unfortunately, these economists that studied food aid, they found that the actual tangible effect of food aid was to increase violence, was to increase war and conflict in the places where food aid went. I won't go through all the ways that they demonstrated this in evidence. They had a very clever empirical design to show this, and it was very convincing, and appeared in the leading journal in economics, the American Economic Review. And some of their examples I think, give you sort of an idea of how this happens. The Somali warlords steal the food aid. They use the food aid to feed the soldiers. They trade the food aid for more guns. The Taliban does the same. This is sort of happening over and over again, and so the net effect of food aid is very different from the intention. Instead of feeding people, it's increasing war and making things worse. On the other side, here are some really evil, greedy corporations, Cargill and Monsanto. I particularly chose the corporations that I could think of that were the most unpopular possible for this audience, including my own wife and daughter who are here who hate Monsanto. I hope you appreciate that. So even despite all their best efforts of just not really wanting to do any good for anyone, just wanting to be greedy and enrich themselves and just get more corporate profits, they just can't help themselves accidentally doing good for people and actually alleviating world hunger. Because the only way they can satisfy their greedy goals of enriching and paying higher CEO salaries is by selling more of grain to very hungry people around the world. More sales means more profits, and they have to compete with other equally greedy corporations to get more sales. And so even against their best intentions of simply enriching themselves, they accidentally do more good than food aid does in actually alleviating world hunger. So here's one of our examples of two effects that were going in opposite directions. The one that meant to do good actually did harm. The one that meant to just do selfish things actually wound up doing good. So let me give you some more examples of spontaneous orders that could be either good or bad. And so where we're going with all this is the best thing economists can do is sort of figuring out what are the principles that make spontaneous order likely to deliver good results or bad results. Here's a very bad result that the spontaneous order of markets delivered, and that was Bernie Madoff, who stole a remarkable $20 billion. I didn't know that figure until I actually did the research for this slide. He managed to steal over a very long period of time $20 billion and enrich himself. And so clearly, if the market system is creating a lot of Bernie Madoffs, then we're in serious trouble. Fortunately, the market system is also producing a lot of Beyoncés, whose net worth is $450 million. And there are some signs that maybe the principles of the market system are in the right direction, because Bernie Madoff is now serving a sentence of 150 years in jail, and Beyonce is not in jail. She gets to keep her $450 million and keep enriching herself. She made $51 million more last year alone, so she'll keep adding to her wealth. And why is she doing that? She's doing that because she gives us stuff that we apparently want. Not that I actually want, but a lot of people actually want. And by supplying things that people actually want, she enriches herself. And so something about the market system is almost partially getting it right, that we are really punishing the guy who enriched himself at the expense of others with 150 years in jail, and we're enriching the woman who's giving us what we really want. So that's some illustration of a principle that the market system is a spontaneous order, that if it follows that principle continuously, is more likely to get things right. Now, what about the political system? Politicians can also deliver bad outcomes. This is a photograph of the famous traffic jam on the George Washington Bridge, the Bridge Gate, apparently created by Chris Christie's staff. So here is a politician who really did do some really bad things to his own voters. But there were consequences for that. The consequence was that Chris Christie is now forced to stand behind Donald Trump. His own presidential campaign has failed, partially because of Bridgegate. And he's forced to stand in a place where he really looks like he would really like to be somewhere else. So this is really a really bad moment to be celebrating the virtues of democracy. But, and I'll get to that a little bit later on in this presentation. But at least the politics is getting something a little bit right, that it is punishing the people who deliver bad payoffs to the voters. And here's a picture of the traffic jams that were artificially induced by all the other 49 state governors. This is all the traffic jams that were done by the other 49 state governors. Apparently somebody learned a lesson from Chris Christie. The most dramatic evidence for spontaneous orders is often what they successfully prevent happening. It's all the traffic jams that didn't happen. It's all the Bernie Madoffs that didn't happen that are often the most successful evidence for the benefits of a spontaneous order. So what is the key principle that these examples illustrate? So economists have a very simple principle for this, that a spontaneous order, like a market or a political system, works well when private returns equal social returns, or I'll use the more accessible terms, payoffs. So when private payoffs are approximately equal to the social payoffs for the actor who's acting, whether it's a politician or an entrepreneur or a business or a consumer, that's the principle under which a spontaneous order works well. So what does that mean? Beyonce sort of got both a social payoff and a private payoff. She created a social payoff with her song. She got a private payoff. Bernie Madoff obviously created a negative social payoff. He got a very negative private payoff after enriching himself for a long time. He got a major jail term. So that's basically the principle that you need to operate to make a spontaneous order work well. How can we sort of reduce this fundamental kind of principle to something even more fundamental? And I think that is individual rights. That simply recognizing individual rights around the world and in our society, that is the fundamental principle that makes social payoffs likely to be equal to private payoffs. Why is that? Well, what do we mean when we talk about individual rights? You get to choose who supplies your needs, so that's how people get those positive private payoffs to Beyonce when she creates positive social payoffs. You get rights that protect you against theft or violence or coercion by the government or by private parties. So that was what went so badly wrong in the example with food aid, is that it went into an environment where there were agents who did violent coercion that violated the rights of Somalis and Afghans, that you had an institutional environment that created private payoffs for warlords and for the Taliban, but very negative social payoffs. So that's the fundamental principle. Why did that happen? Because the rights of ordinary Afghans and Somalis were being violated. You get the rights to enforcements of contracts, which means the prevention of fraud. That prevents the Bernie Madoffs. You get the right to vote against or protest public officials that do harm to you. That's what brought down Chris Christie's presidential campaign. You get the right to vote for politicians. That's why the other 49 governors are doing a little better than Chris Christie, who don't do bad things to you. You have the right to a free press and free speech. That's how things like Bridgegate get exposed. And you have the rights of minorities against the tyranny of the majority. That's the thing that I'm going to comment a little bit on at the end of this talk. Now, unfortunately, in foreign aid, things have not been going that well on the front of individual rights. This is a story that I've told before, but I'm going to tell it again because it's very evocative of how in the foreign aid system rights are not respected, and how, as a result, you do not get private payoffs equaling social payoffs. So this was a World Bank-sponsored forestry project in a district called Mubende, Uganda, that happened in 2010. That resulted in the eviction of farmers that were living on the land, even though it was their land where the forestry project happened. The company and the government that was cooperating with the company sent in soldiers that burned down the houses of the farmers, torched their crops, killed their cattle, marched 20,000 farmers away at gunpoint under the guises of a World Bank financed forestry project. And so the photograph on the left is one of the burned out houses. The photograph on the right is one of the houses that some of the farmers are now living in after they were evicted from their land. So unlike many other rights abuses that happen around the world, this one was actually exposed on the front page of the New York Times. And I know about this because I was writing a blog called Aid Watch at the time that this came out in the New York Times right after, it came out in 2011, a few months after these events happened. And so Aid Watch and I exposed this kind of horrendous miscarriage of the elementary rights of poor people, reinforcing the New York Times story. And the World Bank tweeted this tweet at me immediately when our Aid Watch story came out. They said, as you can read, "We're taking this allegation very seriously. We're looking into it." They're promising to do an investigation. And they said, of course, that their intentions were good. This is another case of good intentions, bad outcomes, unintended outcomes. And why did the unintended outcomes? Because they themselves did not seem to care that they had violated the rights of Ugandans and that they were lending into an environment where the rights of Ugandans were not respected. So that would be bad enough. What's even worse is that this investigation that the World Bank promised right here, it's now 6 years later, that investigation never happened. And what's even worse than that is really nobody much complained about that investigation never happened. Nobody really paid much attention after the initial New York Times story to whether the investigation happened or not. So basically, it was because the World Bank and many other aid agencies are able to operate with impunity with regard to the rights of the poor, that they are operating in an environment where they can indeed be doing projects that they intend to have positive effects, but actually have negative, unintended consequences. And this failure to respect the rights of the poor is violating this elementary principle that it is required in order to make a spontaneous order, like the spontaneous order of development, work well. Now, development people get very impatient with this. They say, you're making things so complicated, but spontaneous order is it's not my fault. It's not the fault of any economist. It's not the fault of evolution is not the fault of Matt Ridley. You have to deal with the fact that development is a spontaneous order, and you have to honor the principles that make spontaneous orders work well. So individual rights are both a means to make the spontaneous order of development work better and an end in themselves. So we love individual rights both because we believe in them in and of themselves as a good thing, both for ourselves and for everyone else, but also because they are the fundamental principle that makes the spontaneous order of development work well, that makes social payoffs equal to private payoffs. So, what seems to be happening in development and what causes everyone to ask what use is the idea of spontaneous development is, people in development, they really do want the action plans. They really do want the bed nets that will directly have the effect of decreasing malaria. So in development, we tend to overemphasize the tangible actions like bed nets that cure malaria or like the food aid. And we really underemphasize the education and advocacy about the principles that would make development work well, like individual rights that make social payoffs equal to private payoffs. Does advocacy actually work? Should we be doing more of it in development? That's really what I'm arguing today. We've been doing too much of the tangible, putting too much of the emphasis on tangible actions and too little of the emphasis on advocacy and education. And there actually is some anecdotal evidence that advocacy in the very long run can work. Mr. Gandhi was successful in bringing about the end of British colonialism, him and many others that were just engaged in advocacy, saying colonialism is wrong. Martin Luther King, his most famous speech is not called "I Have an Action Plan." It was just about a principle that everyone deserves to be free at last, free at last, free at last. Do we need more advocacy? Now I'm going to go to a place you were not expecting. Yes, we do need more advocacy of equal rights for everyone. And development economists are supposed to stay within their proper boundaries and only talk about development and not about U.S. politics or immigration or racism and xenophobia in the U.S., but it's really all connected. How credible can we be advocating equal rights for the rest of the world when there's a candidate like Mr. Trump reflecting so much xenophobia and racism towards Muslims and towards Latinos and towards blacks in our own country? It's really all connected. This universal advocacy for equal rights, for individual rights, is really what we need in development now. And in the end, of course, it's always a lot easier to care about freedom for ourselves than freedom for others. But Abraham Lincoln said a long time ago, in 1859, those who deny freedom to others don't deserve it for themselves. And so that's a reminder that really all of this is all connected, that racism and xenophobia and equal rights, both at home and abroad, is what we should be talking about in development, is what we do need to have spontaneous orders in development work well, to provide the benefits that they're intended to provide. So we do need to find and recognize more Abraham Lincolns, more Martin Luther Kings, more Gandhis around the world who will remind us once again that all men and women, rich and poor, Muslim and Christian, black and white, everyone are indeed created equal, and everyone does indeed deserve to be free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank you.